Betrayal. Cart moved close to his father, without getting noticed, and whispered into his ear, "The helmets are a barrier against mental manipulation. Here somebody can read minds." Chester nodded, understanding that unusual shape, which he remembered, thinking about it, that he had seen one in Diana's car. In the basement, he found something he had not expected. Around a transparent glass table with blue lines was Cart's sister, who he immediately recognized because she looked just like Ariel, with her mother's wonderful eyes, although to her misfortune she had inherited her father's rather prosperous nose. She was in handcuffs. The professor sat there also, looking through some documents, with one arm of his glasses between his teeth. Opposite them was a team of researchers, in white coats, and Chester's father-in-law, whilst sat at the head of the table, very probably the head of those violent madmen, sat Diana. "Are you surprised, my darling?" In disbelief and filled with anger, Chester growled. "I thought you were innocent. Did you always pretend, all those years spent together?" Like an ice queen, she looked him straight in the eyes and without an ounce of compassion answered, "It was nothing more than an investment. It was the best way to keep you under control, safe from your stupidity and, most of all, from your hormones. Shame about my friend's blow, but if I had stayed with you, without pretending to get mad, people might have been suspicious. The farce could have gone on a while longer, at least up to the point the explosive hidden in the boxes of spare parts you'd ordered for your bloody bikes would blow up in your face when you opened them. You would have gone without the trouble and expense of hiring someone to kill you. I see you're doing well, in spite of months of being fed rat poison. You never even realized that your morning coffee was laced with strychnine," Chester asked in disgust. "Why bother kill me?" But she explained that the time had come when he no longer posed a threat to her project. The psychiatrist she had paid dearly to work on Ariel had almost prescribed her enough poison to kill her, although it had been a waste of time, as the silly girl wrote a note to her doctor, stating that she could not live without Chester and intended to end her own life. She would have died a moment before the satellite launch, so the future would have not changed much. Then she looked into his eyes, as if searching for something, and said, with an air of disgust, "What on earth did she see in a lump like you?" Hurt by those words, oblivious of all the weapons pointed at him and of the orders to be still, Chester grabbed a chair and sat down. He turned to his daughter. Her eyes were deep, intelligent. They revealed a good and sensitive soul. His evil father-in-law stood up slowly and moved closer to Cart. "You're still alive." But not for long. Then he turned towards Chester and slapped him hard enough to make his head spin, searched his pockets, and took back the codes they had stolen from him. "But why do you want those codes? Aren't you rich enough? Why sell the planet to the highest bidder?" asked Chester, slamming his hands onto the table, awaiting the man's response. "Simple, you idiot. I want to rule the world." "Think that's too much," the old man answered, puffing his chest up and resting his fists on his hips as he looked around the room with wild eyes. It was obvious that he had lost his mind and that his old age had only increased his megalomania. Chester had been so close to those people, yet he had never realized what was going on. They ate and slept under the same roof, yet he never realized how he was being manipulated. He had allowed himself to be fooled by the freedom which Diana had allowed him, by buying all those expensive toys, computers, latest phones, motorcycles, and sport cars. He had even believed that his work at the office had been worth all that. Even his job had been a planned farce, to keep him happy, the way one might fill a dog's bowl with snacks to keep him quiet. His bowl had always been overflowing. He was confused, his head spinning with the full realization of what a terrifying situation he was in. On one side, the woman he had married and loved wanted him dead. On the other were his 2 children, born of the deep true love he felt for Ariel, the sole woman in the world who did have the right to kill him, for all the suffering he had caused her. Chester had his elbows on the table and his head in his hands, in desperation. He looked at his children and understood that they felt no anger towards him, just a lot of love and a deep desire to be with him. In a matter of days he had discovered that he was father to a boy and a girl, who someone had gone to the trouble of kidnapping from the future. He felt the weight of responsibility which a father feels for his children, and he just had to do all he could to get them out of that mess. He sprang to his feet, which immediately alarmed the guards behind him, who promptly pointed their machine guns at his back, and he shouted, "You have the codes, you crazy old fool! What else do you want? Let us go." The professor moved to answer, but Diana stopped him with a movement of a hand and said, "Unfortunately, you have to go. My father has seen the future, and, as long as you and your brats live, my plan to rule this shitty planet is under threat. But first, the professor needs to run some tests on the amazing time machines you wear on your wrists." Laughing, the Diana's father added, "It'll hurt a bit. You know, heat damages the bracelet. I wish we'd known that before. We would have simply cut Mario's arm off. What a shame. That boy was my favorite lickspittle." Without fear, but with his entire body filled with anger, Chester lost his temper and, beating his fists onto the table, he shouted at Diana, "Then what? Have us killed? Why not do it yourself? You bitch." She laughed and answered calmly, "No, I don't want you dead, just frozen. I'll have you put under ice, in case I need you at a later time. I could kill you now, if you prefer." She stretched out one arm, to be handed a gun by the soldier behind her, and pointed it at him, ready to shoot. At that point, Chester went mad, elbowed the man behind him in the gut, and spun around, slipping the gun off his hands. Bang! A bullet hit him on the back and pierced him through the chest. Chester stopped and fell on the floor with his face up, lifeless. Diana, cold and merciless, once shot her ex-husband. She turned and aimed at the girl. Shot on the shoulder, she fell to the ground and banged her head. The third shot was aimed at the boy, but Chester was not yet dead. His eyesight was blurred, but he was certain that his life would be over in seconds, and he had to try to save his children. Upon his arrival in the basement, he had noticed that the table surrounded by all those assassins was the same as the table in Argo's bunker. He gathered the strength to take off the glove that covered his ring and pushed his fist against the base of the table and ardently wished them all pulverized. And so it was. A blinding wall of light rose from the entire surface of the table, making a hole in the ceiling, and disintegrated the hands and arms of all those who were leaning upon it. Everyone else was blinded. Only Cart, who had understood his father's movements, had covered his eyes. The old man was screaming, incredulously staring at his hands, which seconds earlier had been attached to his wrists. All the armed guards had fallen to the ground, blinded by the bright light, and were twisting around and screaming from the intense pain in their eyes. The professor was unharmed, as he had reacted by jumping off his chair and crouched in a corner, gasping in fear. Diana, cunning as ever, had been fast to move away, but was also on the ground, stunned. Cart lifted his father onto his shoulders, grabbed his sister with one hand, and dragged out through the door, to safety. The three of them left the building, and the warm sunshine reassured them, but it was not over. As they emerged through the front door, they were faced with a bunch of alien creatures, gigantic lizards who walked on their hind legs, at least 7 feet tall, protected by a metal exoskeleton, which covered part of their slimy and squamous body. On their heads, they wore black helmets, flat at the top and sides, but elongated at the back. From their mouth protruded a large metallic pincer, sort of like a huge pair of open scissors. Diana was in charge of those alien warriors, and she stood right behind the trio, with her face burned and her hands firmly holding a machine gun. Chester murmured to his daughter, "What's your name?" And the girl, with tears in her eyes, "Kira, Daddy." He rubbed his eyes. He wanted to see her properly for the first and last time, and he realized that she looked just like him. Cart was also seeing her for the first time, and he was moved, but at that moment Chester, still on his son's shoulders, murmured, "Forgive me," and lost consciousness. Kira leant on him delicately, squeezed his hand, and cried like never before. Cart removed his glove. He could not run away and leave his father like that and his sister wounded. He could not carry them away, as the temporal bubble the ring could create would not sustain the energy of 3 bodies. He also knew that he could not have fought those aliens. He had encountered their kind in his travels through time, and he knew only too well how fearsome they were. He could never have fought them on his own, but he had to try. With his father still on his back, he spun around, knocking the gun off Diana's hands, then turned to the enemy and beat the first. The others started running towards him, opening and closing their pincers menacingly. All of a sudden, he heard a noise. A storm of helicopters distracted the lizards, and they stopped. Cart looked up and saw Argo and Rayon leaning out of the side door of the first helicopter. The woods began to crawl with hundreds of soldiers who ran out and immediately fired on the aliens, who tried to escape by running into the wilderness. Landed, Argo ordered Chester's lifeless body to be laid on the ground, then put something into his mouth and poured a liquid into the hole in his chest. Behind them, Diana had vanished, leaving the gun on the ground. Argo took Kira's hands into his own and said, "Don't worry, you'll get your father back."